There are some subjects that arrive with a flash, and some that arrive with a kind of slow, tidal gravity. Whales belong to the second kind. They do not really present themselves as a surprise, even when the facts about them are astonishing. Instead, they rise as something ancient and patient, a body at the surface, a breath in cold air, a dark back sliding forward through a world that seems at once empty and impossibly full. And they're not simply large animals. They are mammals that returned to the sea, lineages that changed the shape of their own bodies over millions of years until legs became memory, nostrils climbed the skull, hearing adapted to water, and the open ocean became not a barrier but a home. And tonight, we will follow that transformation gently, one calm detail at a time. Good evening and welcome in. I'm Madeline Rowe, and tonight we'll drift through the science of whales, from ancient origins to the deep living ocean. If you enjoy these quiet, science-forward episodes, please subscribe and come back for the next case file. Back in my office, a small desk lamp pools warm light across a folder marked simply Whales. The room feels a little like a whale itself when the city settles down. Broad, dim, ribbed with shadow, still on the surface, but holding some deeper pressure underneath. The window beside me is black glass. The radiator gives off a low murmur. Somewhere in the pipes, there is a slow movement I can almost imagine as a distant current. I rest my hand on the folder, open it, and let the first page turn. Before we go anywhere else, it helps to notice a small complication hidden inside a familiar word. Whale sounds simple. It feels like the kind of word that should point neatly to one kind of creature. But in science, things are a little more layered. Whales belong to the cetaceans, the mammalian group that also includes dolphins and porpoises. In everyday speech, people usually separate whales from dolphins and porpoises, as if whales are one thing and the others are cousins, standing just beyond the frame. In a cladistic sense, the borders are blurrier, because all of them belong within cetacea. Still, in common use, whale usually means the larger cetaceans, the baleen whales, and some of the larger toothed forms such as sperm whales, beaked whales, and the Arctic whales. What matters for us tonight is not the argument over the edge of the word, but the broad truth inside it. These are fully aquatic mammals. They breathe air, they nurse their young. Their ancestors lived on land, and they now occupy nearly every ocean on Earth. It took a surprisingly long time for human beings to sort that out properly. Ancient observers were often perceptive about whales in the anatomical sense. Aristotle, for example, recognized that whales and dolphins breathed air, gave birth to live young, and suckled their offspring. He noticed lungs where fish had gills, and he understood that cetaceans differed in important ways from ordinary fishes. But classification has always been vulnerable to surfaces. If an animal lived in the sea and moved with the sea's economy, many people felt pulled to file it with fishes anyway. That intellectual tug lasted for centuries. Observers could gather clues pointing toward mammalian identity and still hesitate before following those clues all the way to the answer. There is something comforting in that history, because it reminds us that science is often not a flash of recognition, but a slow correction of habits. The whale looked fish-like from a distance, and distance kept winning for a long time. Only later, through anatomy, taxonomy, fossils, and eventually genetics, did the deeper picture become stable. Linnaeus placed cetaceans among mammals. fossils later showed that they were not just mammals in a loose, descriptive sense, but mammals with a recoverable terrestrial ancestry. Modern work then linked them within the broader artiodactyl branch. So when we say tonight that a whale is a mammal, we are not repeating a schoolroom category by rote. We are inheriting centuries of observation slowly brought into focus. That long delay also teaches a useful way of looking at whales. They ask us not to stop at environment. A whale lives in water, but that does not make it fish. A whale has a fluke, but that does not make it unrelated to hooved mammals. A whale can spend nearly its whole visible life in the sea and still carry a skeleton, reproductive strategy, and evolutionary history that tell a very different origin story. Once you begin to see whales that way, as mammals transformed rather than marine animals conjured from nowhere, the whole subject becomes calmer and more legible. That alone is enough to make them interesting. Mammals began on land. They are built in the deepest inherited sense for air, for gravity, for limbs pushing against a surface. Yet whales took that terrestrial inheritance and revised it piece by piece. If you look at a modern whale long enough, what first appears purely alien begins to resolve into rearranged familiarity. There are 4 limbs, but they have become flippers. There is a spine, but it flexes through water rather than overground. There are lungs, but the animal spends most of its life beneath the surface. There are nipples and milk and warm blood, but all of it is carried inside an environment that strips heat away far faster than air ever could. Whale biology is full of these tensions, these elegant solutions to old mammalian problems in a new setting. It is tempting, when speaking about whales, to begin with size. The blue whale invites that instinct almost immediately. It is hard not to mention that the blue whale is the largest animal known to have lived. That fact lands with a kind of clean force. Yet size, while real and impressive, can also distract from the subtler wonder. A whale is not extraordinary only because it is large. It is extraordinary because it represents one of evolution's great transformations. It is a land mammal rewritten for life in water, and then rewritten again into many different ecological styles. Some whales became skimmers and filter feeders. Some became deep divers and hunters in darkness. Some came to rely on coders, songs, whistles, and clicks. Some developed lives in which mothers and calves remain together for years, or in which social knowledge seems to move from one generation to the next. And all of that sits inside a group whose story begins not in the open sea, but near warm, ancient shores. The fossil story of whales is one of those rare scientific stories that really does reward close attention. For a long time, whales were difficult to place. They were obviously not fish, because they breathed air and suckled their young. But they were also so transformed by aquatic life that their relationship to land mammals was not immediately obvious. Even careful observers across many centuries were pulled in different directions. The modern solution came through a combination of comparative anatomy, paleontology, and later molecular evidence. And once the fossils began to arrive in sequence, the broad arc came into focus. The ancestors of whales were not some separate aquatic branch that had always belonged to the sea. They were artiodactyl relatives, close on the mammalian map to the line that also leads to hippos, though not descended from hippos themselves. The split between cetaceans and their closest non-cetacean living relatives lies tens of millions of years in the past, in the Eocene world. That Eocene world was not the world we know. The continents were arranged differently, climates were warmer, shallow seas spread across regions that today are dry land. In that setting, the earliest phases of whale evolution seem to have unfolded along the margins of the ancient Tethys. The names come quietly at first: Himalayacetus, Pachycetus, Ambulocetus, Protocytids, Basilosaurids. They sound a little like evidence tags in a long investigation, each one representing not a final answer, but a stage in a transformation. Pachycetus is often brought forward as one of the earliest well-known forms in this story. It did not look like a modern whale. If you passed it without context, you would not mistake it for a great creature of the open sea. It was semi-aquatic, a mammal still tied in many ways to land, but its skull and ear region were already beginning to show the signatures that connect it to later whales. This is part of what makes the sequence so satisfying. Evolution does not leap from deer-like land mammal to blue whale in one theatrical jump. It leaves clues in anatomy. It shifts one system, then another. Hearing changes, limbs change, the position of the nostrils changes, locomotion changes, reproduction and habitat use shift gradually in step with all the rest. After forms such as Pachycetus come the more amphibious-looking archaeocetes, creatures like Ambulocetus and the Protocytids. They seem to belong to shorelines, estuaries, river mouths, shallow seas, the sort of places where categories blur. They were neither creatures of dry inland plains nor fully pelagic animals in the modern sense. Some likely moved through water with powerful hind limbs and webbed feet. Some may have hauled themselves ashore. In these forms, the whale lineage still carries the visible grammar of walking mammals, but it is beginning to speak a different language. There is something especially calming about imagining that middle part of the story, not because it is simple, but because it is gradual. The body is experimenting. The skeleton is testing alternatives. In some early whales, the hind limbs remain important. In later forms, their role diminishes. The sacrum, once important for transmitting force from hind limbs into the body during terrestrial locomotion, begins to lose its old purpose. The skull changes too. The nostrils start their migration up the face. The animal becomes more streamlined. The balance between paddling with limbs and driving with the tail begins to shift. By the time we reach animals such as Myocetus, we are already in a world of strong aquatic commitment, but not yet complete departure from shore. Myocetus is often described as semi-aquatic, a foot-powered swimmer with a heavy tail helping stabilize movement. It is one of those forms that reminds us evolution can proceed through workable intermediates rather than incomplete failures. Myocetus was not a defective modern whale. It was a successful mammal of its own time, built for its own environment, good enough to survive in the ecological space it inhabited. That matters because it's easy to imagine transitional animals as awkward stepping stones. In reality, they were living species, not prototypes. Then, later in the Eocene, we come to the Basilosaurids, among them Dorudon and Basilosaurus. Here, the transformation feels much more complete. Dorudon was fully aquatic, propelled by the tail, with hind limbs reduced to small external remnants that no longer served any meaningful role in locomotion. The body now belongs unmistakably to the sea. The forelimbs have become flippers. The tail bears a fluke. The nostrils sit higher. The animal is no longer solving the problem of how to divide its life between shore and water. It has crossed the line. It is a whale in the deep anatomical sense, even if it still differs from modern forms. One detail I like to linger on is the fluke. When we picture whales, the tail fluke feels almost inevitable, as if the body simply always knew it would end that way. But it did not. The fluke is part of the solution, not the starting point. A modern whale swims by driving that horizontal tail up and down, flexing the spine vertically. This is unlike fish, whose tails move side to side. The distinction is not trivial. It tells you that the whale body, despite all its marine adaptation, still bears the mark of mammalian ancestry. The stroke comes from the spine and musculature of an air-breathing vertebrate whose ancestors moved in a very different medium. Another detail is the blowhole. To us, it seems almost symbolic of whales, a simple mark on the top of the head where breath becomes visible. But that feature too has a history. The nostrils did not begin there. Over evolutionary time, they migrated rearward and upward, which made surface breathing more efficient. A whale does not need to lift its whole face from the water to inhale. It can surface, expose the top of the head, exchange gases quickly, and descend again. Seen from far away, a blow can look almost ceremonial. Up close, it is engineering. At some point after these Archaeocete stages, the lineage that includes modern whales splits into two great living branches, the baleen whales, or Mysticeti, and the toothed whales, or Odontoceti. The fossil record suggests that modern Mysticetes and Odontocetes begin to appear near the latest Eocene or early Oligocene, in a world undergoing cooling, sea level change, and altered ocean circulation. And here the story becomes not just one of entering the sea, but of dividing the sea in different ways. Mysticetes move toward filter feeding. Odontocetes remain hunters with teeth, and many later develop the extraordinary sound-based sensing systems we associate with echolocation. If the first half of whale evolution is a return to water, the next major chapter is an ecological divergence. Two different answers to the question of how a large marine mammal should make its living. Let us take the baleen route first, because it is so visually strange, and, in its own way, so serene. Baleen whales do not chew prey in the manner of land carnivores. Instead, they use keratinous plates hanging from the upper jaw. These plates form a filtering apparatus. Water comes in, prey remains, water goes out. Depending on the species, the exact feeding mode varies. Some skim, some gulp vast volumes of prey-rich water. Some forage on tiny crustaceans such as krill, while others may take small fish as well. The result is one of the great paradoxes of marine ecology. Among the largest animals on Earth are creatures that often feed on some of the smallest prey items in the sea. Baleen itself deserves a moment, because it is one of those structures that looks almost mythic until you remember what it is made of. Baleen is keratin, the same broad material family that makes up hair and fingernails. In a whale, however, that familiar material grows into great fringed plates hanging from the upper jaw. Water can pass through, prey cannot or cannot easily. The tongue helps manipulate the mouthful, the jaws and throat structures support the process, and the filtering surface does the patient work. What from a distance looks like a mouth built for swallowing indiscriminately turns out, on closer examination, to be a highly specialized sieve. In rorquals, the feeding event can be dramatic. The pleated throat expands, the lower jaw opens wide, and a volume of water and prey rushes in that seems almost absurd for one animal to contain. Then comes the compression phase, as the water is forced out and the prey remains behind. Watching a lunge-feeding whale on the surface can give the impression of brute force alone, but that would miss the precision involved. The whale has to find prey dense enough to justify the attempt, coordinate speed and mouth opening, and then process the engulfed volume quickly enough to make the whole strategy efficient. The blue whale represents the extreme end of this style in the popular imagination. It pursues krill, often in cold, productive regions where seasonal blooms support staggering biomass. The animal's size is not a contradiction of its prey choice. It is the consequence of a food web in which tiny organisms can occur in such density that gigantism becomes viable. A blue whale is able to live at that scale because the ocean, in the right places and seasons, produces vast drifts of small prey. In that sense, the blue whale is not merely a giant, it is a reading of abundance written into flesh. Humpbacks use the same broad baleen toolkit, but with a different reputation. Their bubble net feeding has become almost emblematic of coordinated marine behaviour. A group may dive beneath a school of fish, release rising spirals or curtains of bubbles, and then surge upward through the concentrated prey. Some observations suggest vocal cues are involved in organising the event. Even without assigning too much certainty to every detail, the pattern is clear enough. Humpbacks can turn water into structure and prey behaviour into a trap. Right whales and bowheads, meanwhile, suggest a quieter version of baleen life. Their mouths and baleen are suited to skimming and filtering rich concentrations of copepods and similar prey. Rather than the engulf and purge drama of rorquals, their feeding can seem almost contemplative from a distance, a long passage through productive water with the apparatus working continuously. The bowhead adds an Arctic frame to the picture. A huge skull, thick insulating blubber, dark water under ice, and feeding in some of the most seasonally extreme marine environments on Earth. It is worth noticing that all of these animals are carnivorous, even when their prey are tiny. Baleen feeding can look pastoral in comparison with the pursuit of squid or fish, and people sometimes slip into talking about mysticetes as though they graze the sea like cows in a field. But that metaphor only goes so far. The prey may be small crustaceans or schooling fish, but they are still animals. Both major whale branches remain within a broadly carnivorous mammalian world. They simply partition that world differently. The blue whale is the obvious example. It is difficult to think of another animal in which size and prey seem so mismatched at first glance. A body of astonishing mass, supported by swarms of krill. But that is the sea for you. In the ocean, small things can occur in unimaginable abundance. Dense patches of krill can make gigantism possible. A blue whale is not disproving ecological logic. It is obeying it at a massive scale. Rorquals, the family that includes blue whales, fin whales, sei whales, minke whales, and humpbacks, often feed by lunge feeding. The mouth opens, throat pleats expand, and an enormous mouthful of prey-laden water is engulfed. Then the water is forced back out through the baleen, leaving food behind. It is a style of feeding that depends on mobility, timing, and access to dense prey patches. Even in an animal this large, the act itself is dynamic. These are not passive drifters. They are active foragers exploiting rich but patchy resources. Right whales and bowheads represent a different mood within the baleen world. They are generally slower-moving skim feeders, using long baleen plates to strain dense concentrations of copepods and other small organisms. Their feeding can feel less explosive than a rorqual lunge, more like a patient passage through rich water. Bowheads, especially, bring the story into Arctic conditions. Thick blubber, sea ice, long migrations between feeding and calving areas, and a life lived at the margin between open water and frozen cover. Humpback whales sit in an interesting middle ground for the human imagination, because they are both baleen whales and social celebrities. People know them for song, for breaching, for bubble net feeding. They are a useful reminder that baleen whales are not simply giant filters devoid of complexity. They coordinate, they migrate, they produce culturally transmitted songs. They raise calves that learn roots and habits in a world shaped by both instinct and experience. Now the toothed branch. Odontocetes retain teeth and a predatory mode of life. Some are relatively small dolphins and porpoises. Some are beaked whales built for deep diving. Some are sperm whales, a line so distinctive that it feels like a chapter all its own. In informal, everyday usage, not every odontocete is called a whale, but several certainly are, and they matter greatly to the scientific story. The sperm whale, in particular, is a magnificent contrast to the baleen giants. Where the blue whale is often imagined in open, prey-rich surface waters, feeding on swarms of krill, the sperm whale draws us downward into the dark. It is a toothed whale, a hunter of squid and other deep-sea prey, capable of diving to extraordinary depths and staying down for astonishing periods. If the baleen whale story is partly about scale at the surface, the sperm whale story is about depth, pressure, oxygen, and darkness. This brings us to one of the most beautiful subjects in whale science, diving physiology. A whale is an air-breathing mammal in an environment that offers no oxygen to lungs. Every dive is, in a sense, a negotiation between stored oxygen, metabolic demand, and the need to return. Yet different whales negotiate that problem in remarkably different ways. Start with the ordinary terrestrial mammal body as a reference point. In humans and many land mammals, gas exchange happens in the lungs. Oxygen is carried in the blood, muscles use it, and carbon dioxide and other metabolic byproducts accumulate as activity continues. Long submergence is difficult because oxygen stores are limited and tissues are not built for extended anaerobic strain. Whales, by contrast, possess a suite of adaptations that make diving not an emergency but a normal part of life. One adaptation is simply how effectively they use inhaled oxygen. Cetaceans can extract far more of the oxygen from a breath than terrestrial mammals usually do. Their blood volume is also greater relative to body size, which means they can carry more oxygen bound to hemoglobin. And then there is myoglobin, the oxygen-binding pigment in muscle. In whales, especially strong divers, muscle tissues can store very large quantities of oxygen because of high myoglobin concentrations. In effect, the body spreads the oxygen budget across blood and muscle in a way that gives the dive greater endurance. Another adaptation involves circulation. During deep dives, blood flow can be redistributed away from less immediately essential tissues and maintained for the most vital organs, especially the brain. Heart rate can slow dramatically, a phenomenon known as bradycardia. If you were to imagine the whale body as a city at night, this would be the controlled dimming of certain districts so that the central systems remain lit. Metabolic demand drops where it can. The animal becomes selective about where energy is spent. The lungs themselves behave differently than many people first assume. It is tempting to think of a deep diving whale simply holding a large breath in large lungs. But at depth, the lungs can collapse under pressure, reducing issues related to nitrogen absorption and shifting the animal's dependence toward oxygen already stored in blood and muscle. That is part of the reason the deepest diving whales are not merely oversized breath holders, they are physiologically specialized divers. Sperm whales make a good focal point here. Reports and reviews describe dives beyond 2 kilometers and breath holds far longer than any casual mammalian intuition would predict. The descent is not frantic, it is deliberate. A large animal leaves the bright surface, passes through layers where the water cools and darkens, and continues into pressure regimes that would crush ordinary assumptions about how a mammal should live. Down there, it hunts squid, using sound, anatomy, and physiology evolved for precisely that purpose. Beaked whales deserve a quiet mention too, because many of them are among the deepest divers in the animal kingdom. They do not dominate popular imagination the way humpbacks or blue whales do, but they are another demonstration that toothed whales did not merely retain teeth and call it a day. They diversified into acoustic hunters of the deep, many of them elusive and rarely seen at the surface for long. If diving physiology explains how whales can vanish beneath the surface, acoustics explains how many of them continue to understand the world while they are gone. Water is a difficult medium for vision across long distances, especially in darkness or murk. Sound, by contrast, travels very well. It is no accident that whales are an acoustic civilization. Part of what makes that acoustic life so elegant is that it does not replace the body's older senses so much as reorganize their importance. Vision still matters. Touch matters enormously, especially between mothers and calves, or among closely associated individuals. But sound offers range, persistence, and structure in a medium where light is often limited. A whale can listen through darkness. A group can remain socially coherent when bodies are separated by distance or obscured by waves. A hunting-toothed whale can transform echoes into a map. Echolocation, where it occurs, is one of the clearest examples of this. Toothed whales generate clicks and interpret the returning echoes to identify prey, obstacles, and aspects of the surrounding environment. To us, whose daily world is visually dominated, that can feel almost like a superpower. But to the whale, it is simply one of the ordinary ways the world becomes knowable. The click goes out, the echo returns altered, and shape, distance, texture, and movement begin to take form in sound. Baleen whales are usually discussed differently because their low-frequency calls and songs do not function like odontocete echolocation. Even so, sound remains central. Low frequencies can travel immense distances in seawater under the right conditions. A call can move far beyond the line of sight, stitching separated animals into an acoustic space larger than any one body could see. When humpbacks sing on breeding grounds, or when other baleen whales call across broad marine landscapes, they are participating in a kind of long-range environment making. The ocean becomes not just a place they occupy, but a place they actively sound into being. There is a softer side to all of this as well, and it has to do with rest. Whales are conscious breathers. They cannot simply surrender to deep unconscious sleep for long periods, the way many terrestrial mammals do, because they still need to surface and breathe. In toothed cetaceans at least, research has shown forms of unihemispheric sleep, in which one side of the brain rests at a time while the other remains more alert. Baleen whales are harder to study directly in this regard, especially in the wild, but the broad lesson is still calming to contemplate. Even their rest has been adapted to the sea. They inhabit a world in which breathing remains a voluntary rhythm, and sleep itself bends around that necessity. It is one more example of the same deeper rule. The whale body is not made by discarding mammalian life, but by negotiating with it. The animal must still breathe, still circulate, still sleep, still communicate, still remember where to go. The ocean does not erase those obligations. It changes the terms under which they are met. We should be a little careful with the word civilization, because it carries human baggage. But in a loose, respectful sense, it points us toward something real. Many cetaceans inhabit a world structured by sound. Toothed whales use clicks, whistles, and other signals for navigation, hunting, social coordination, and recognition. Baleen whales produce low-frequency calls that can travel across great distances. Humpback males create songs that change over time. Sperm whales exchange codas. Killer whales can possess group-specific dialects. These are not random noises sprinkled over a silent sea. They are structured signals in an environment where acoustics may matter as much as sight, or more. Humpback song is perhaps the most famous example, partly because to human ears it sounds uncannily patterned. Humpback songs are not static, they change through time, and populations can converge on new versions. This is one of the reasons researchers speak of cultural transmission in cetaceans. A humpback does not inherit every detail of song genetically like the colour of an eye. It learns within a social and acoustic context. Song can spread, shift, and be copied. That idea of culture deserves a gentle, careful approach. In animals, culture is usually defined not as art museums or written law, but as behavioural variation maintained and transmitted through social learning. On that definition, cetaceans offer some compelling examples. Group-specific dialects in killer whales, codas in sperm whales, song transmission in humpbacks, learned foraging traditions, cooperative hunting styles, and even certain migration habits all suggest that information can move through whale societies by teaching, imitation, or other forms of social learning. This does not make whales human. It makes them something perhaps more interesting, themselves, with their own roots to complexity. The social lives of whales vary widely across species. Some are more solitary, some aggregate loosely around food or migration. Others form stable social groups that can endure for years or decades. Sperm whales, for example, are known for matrilineal social units in which females and young remain together, and in which calves can depend on mothers and associated adults for long periods. Observations suggest that group members may assist with calf care, allowing mothers to dive deeply while others remain nearer the surface. In that image alone, there is a whole quiet social world. One adult descending into darkness, another remaining above with the young, an invisible pattern of trust and timing. Killer whales, though technically large dolphins, are difficult to leave out of any conversation about whale culture and intelligence because the evidence around them is so vivid. In many resident populations, offspring remain with their natal pod for life. Dialects differ among groups. Hunting techniques can vary by ecotype and region. Some pods specialise on fish, others on marine mammals. In Patagonia, the specialised stranding behaviour used to catch pinniped pups is so demanding that researchers have argued it is culturally transmitted. Adults appear not only to perform the behaviour, but in some circumstances to scaffold learning by younger animals. Whether one uses the word teaching in the strongest sense or not, the pattern is extraordinary. What makes these examples matter is not simply that they are clever. Cleverness alone can become a kind of circus act in human storytelling, a way of reducing animals to how much they resemble us when they perform something we recognise. The deeper point is that whale societies can preserve information outside the genome, a route, a call pattern, a feeding tactic, a preference, a timing pattern, a social response to predators or prey. These things may endure not because DNA encodes them in full detail, but because whales learn from whales. That insight reshapes the emotional tone of conservation as well. If a whale population is depleted or destroyed, it is not only bodies that vanish. Under some circumstances, ways of living may vanish too. Dialects can disappear, local foraging traditions can be lost, social structures can be damaged. The species survives on paper, but a form of accumulated experience may still be gone. There is another aspect of whale minds worth approaching with some humility. Cetaceans possess large and anatomically sophisticated brains, but brain size alone is a blunt instrument. The most careful work does not say whales have big brains, therefore whales are just like us. Instead, it asks what kinds of social and ecological pressures might favour large, complex brains in marine mammals. Comparative analyses suggest relationships among social structure, brain size, and the breadth of social or cultural behaviours across cetaceans. Species that live in more complex social settings often show richer social repertoires. That does not settle every philosophical question about consciousness, nor does it make all cetaceans equal in every regard. It does, however, support the sense that large cetacean brains are not evolutionary decoration. They belong to animals navigating information-rich social lives. One of the oldest bonds in those lives is the bond between mother and calf. It may be the most important one. A whale calf enters a world that is vast, cold, and mechanically difficult. It must learn how to surface, breathe efficiently, remain near its mother, travel, respond to sounds, and in time, forage for itself. In some species, the dependency period is long, very long. Among sperm whales and pilot whales, calves can remain associated with their mothers for many years. In some killer whale populations, the family bond may last for life. Even when paternal care is limited or absent, the social framework around calves can be rich with relatives, allies, and familiar voices. The milk that begins a whale life is itself part of the marine solution. Whale milk is extremely rich because the calf must build blubber, grow quickly, and survive in a medium that draws heat away. In migratory baleen whales, the story becomes even more striking. Many mothers travel from high-latitude feeding grounds to warmer breeding and calving grounds. There, in water safer for newborn calves, they may eat little or not at all while nursing. The mother's body becomes a portable reserve, built in one place and spent in another. This is not merely migration as movement, it is migration as life history strategy. Migration in whales has a dreamlike quality because it unfolds on scales larger than ordinary human travel. A whale does not simply move from one patch of habitat to another. Some species move from polar or subpolar feeding grounds to tropical or subtropical breeding areas, and back again, tracing routes older than charts, older than engines, older than our instruments for following them. The timing is often linked to food, temperature, reproduction, and calf survival. In baleen whales, especially, migration can be read as a seasonal exchange. Cold, productive waters for feeding, warmer waters for giving birth, and beginning calf development. The exact details vary among species, and not every migration is equally well understood. But the broad pattern remains one of the great annual motions on Earth. Imagine a humpback leaving rich summer feeding grounds, travelling through open ocean, arriving in warmer breeding waters where males sing and calves are born, and then turning again months later toward colder seas. The animal is carrying memory, physiology, and instinct across enormous distances, all while navigating a world of currents, soundscapes, and changing prey fields. Feeding itself can be as social as migration. Humpback whales in some regions famously practice bubble net feeding. A group circles beneath a school of fish, releasing curtains or spirals of bubbles that constrain the prey. Then the whales surge upward through the concentrated fish. The behaviour is impressive to watch, but more importantly, it reveals coordination. Individuals maintain positions, timing matters. In some reports, vocal signals seem to precede or structure parts of the action. This is not random group feeding. It is an organised exploitation of prey behaviour. Toothed whales show their own versions of feeding sophistication. Sperm whales coordinate within social units, even if their deep hunts are less visible to us. Killer whales vary their hunting style according to prey and ecotype. Some fish-eating populations use tactics suited to schooling fish. Some mammal-eating populations rely on stealth, coordination, and surprise. In Antarctica, some killer whales cooperate to create waves that wash seals from ice floes. Elsewhere, groups may specialise in particular prey with remarkable precision. The ocean is not one problem, it is many. Whale lineages have solved those problems in many ways. Now let us widen the lens beyond the life of an individual whale. One of the most important shifts in modern thinking has been the move from seeing whales only as consumers to seeing them also as ecosystem engineers. For a long time, one common assumption was that large whales simply removed biomass from the system. They ate fish, krill, squid, and so on. But that is too simple. Whales also move nutrients. This is where the phrase whale pump comes in. When whales feed at depth and then return to the surface, they bring nutrients upward. Their feces, often released near the surface, can be rich in substances such as nitrogen and iron. Those nutrients can stimulate phytoplankton growth. Phytoplankton are the base of marine food webs and major players in carbon cycling. So a whale is not only an end point of consumption, it can also act as a vertical transporter, linking deeper feeding with surface productivity. The image is wonderfully humble, not the great whale only as titan, but the great whale as recycler, as circulator, as a living conveyor between layers of the sea. In some systems, researchers have argued that whale nutrient input is substantial, even comparable to or exceeding riverine inputs for certain basins. The exact magnitudes differ by place and method, but the principle is strong. A whale surfaces, exhales, defecates, and in doing so contributes to the fertility of the sea above it. Then there is the whale fall, the final ecosystem service of a dead whale. When a large whale dies and sinks, its carcass becomes a concentrated pulse of energy and structure delivered to the deep sea floor. First come the scavengers, sharks, hagfish, and others stripping soft tissues. Then come organisms exploiting the enriched sediments and bones. Later, bacteria within the bones can produce chemical conditions that support entire communities of specialized deep-sea life. A whale fall can sustain ecological succession for years or decades. In death, as in life, a whale links parts of the ocean that might otherwise remain less connected. At this point in the story, it is almost impossible not to feel a certain steadiness in the overall pattern. Whales are not ornaments on the ocean. They are participants in its function. They eat, migrate, sound, reproduce, defecate, die, sink, and in each of those actions, they affect other lives. Their role is biological, chemical, and physical all at once. And that, perhaps, is what makes the human history with whales feel so consequential. If whales were merely occasional curiosities, the damage done by industrial whaling would still be morally weighty, but ecologically smaller. Instead, large whales were central, and we struck them at scale. The human relationship with whales is older than industry. Coastal peoples observed, revered, hunted, and interpreted whales in many ways over thousands of years. But industrial whaling changed the equation. Before that industrial shift, whales were already entangled with human imagination. They appeared in coastal mythologies, oral traditions, carvings, stories of luck or warning, and records of seasonal abundance. Some communities depended on whale products obtained through local hunting or scavenging from strandings, often within systems of knowledge and restraint shaped by place. None of that history was simple or morally uniform, but it differed in scale from what came later. Industrial whaling converted whales into fuel, raw material, and statistics. Oil from blubber and spermaceti fed lamps and industries. Baleen became material for tools and consumer goods. Meat entered markets. And because whales are large, mobile, and slow to reproduce, the industrial appetite for them could outrun recovery with terrifying speed. The ledger-like language of catches and quotas never quite captures the biological reality beneath it. A whale population is not a warehouse inventory. It is mothers, calves, migration routes, learned behaviours, age structures, and reproductive intervals stretched across decades. That is one reason depletion could be so severe. Remove large numbers of adults from a long-lived species, and you are not just reducing the present. You are hollowing out the future. A female not born because her mother was killed is also missing. So are the calves that female might have produced years later. In a species where reproduction is slow, the silence left behind can extend across generations. Even after commercial whaling declined under legal pressure, the ocean did not become simple again. Shipping expanded. Fishing gear spread through coastal and offshore habitats. Noise increased. Climate signals began to shift the distribution of prey and ice. For whales, modernity often means not one large obvious threat, but a mosaic of smaller mortalities and chronic stresses layered over populations still shaped by historical depletion. The North Atlantic right whale is perhaps the clearest example of how vulnerability can persist in a highly developed world. A whale may survive the age of harpoons only to face busy shipping corridors and lines set in the water column of its remaining range. A calf may be born into a species that has legal protection and scientific attention, yet still live in a geography dense with risk. The animal does not know what a policy is. It only knows whether the route is passable, whether the rope catches, whether the ship arrives first. At the same time, not all modern whale stories are tragedies. Some populations have rebounded enough to remind us that protection can matter. This is important to say quietly, because the conservation imagination sometimes tilts toward either naive optimism or permanent despair. Whale recovery shows that neither extreme is accurate. Protection can work. Moratoria matter. Reduced hunting pressure matters. Management of shipping lanes and fishing practices matters. Monitoring matters. International cooperation matters. But recovery is uneven, fragile, and often slower than public attention prefers. That slowness is not failure, it is biology. A great whale cannot respond to danger by multiplying overnight. Its answer to environmental pressure is not speed of reproduction, but durability of life history. And durability becomes a disadvantage when mortality rises quickly. To help whales, humans often have to learn patience that matches the whale's own timescale. Not passive patience, but sustained attention carried across many years. In the 19th century, and especially with mechanized techniques, explosive harpoons, factory ships, and expanding global fleets, humans gained the ability to kill large whales faster and farther from shore than ever before. Species that had once been protected in part by distance, speed, depth, or remoteness became accessible. Population after population fell. North Atlantic right whales had already been devastated much earlier because they were, from a whaler's perspective, grimly convenient, slow, rich in blubber, and likely to float when killed. Later, blue whales, fin whales, humpbacks, sei whales, sperm whales, bowheads, grey whales, and others were heavily exploited in different regions and periods. Some populations were pushed to fractions of their former size. Some regional populations vanished entirely. One of the haunting things about whaling records is how quickly abundance can begin to feel normal in the imagination, even when it is already gone. A sea emptied over generations may still look like the natural baseline to those born afterward. By the 20th century, concern had begun to organise into law and management, though not always quickly enough and not always effectively. National protections, the Marine Mammal Protection Act in the United States, the Endangered Species Act, and international actions through the International Whaling Commission all became part of the modern framework. The IWC moratorium on commercial whaling, taking effect in the mid-1980s, was one of the decisive turns. It did not erase the damage, but it changed the trajectory for many populations. Recovery, however, is not one story. It is many. Some whale populations have rebounded impressively. Others remain dangerously small, genetically constrained, or subject to ongoing mortality that keeps recovery slow or uncertain. The eastern North Pacific grey whale became a celebrated example of recovery strong enough to justify delisting under US endangered species law in the 1990s. Humpbacks in several regions have shown encouraging returns. Yet North Atlantic right whales remain in precarious condition. Blue whales, fin whales, sei whales, and others carry the long shadow of past depletion. Sperm whales, too, remind us that long-lived, slow-breeding animals do not recover on human emotional timelines. This is a good moment to pause on life history. Whales are not rabbits. They do not solve pressure with rapid reproduction. Many are long-lived, mature slowly, and produce relatively few calves. A female may invest heavily in a single offspring, then wait years before reproducing again. This makes sense for large mammals in stable conditions, especially when survival of adults is usually high. But it also means that external mortality from hunting, ship strikes, entanglement, or severe ecological change can be difficult to absorb. Recovery is possible, but it is often slow. Modern threats no longer always look like harpoons, though sometimes hunting does persist in limited contexts. More often, the hazards are distributed through industrial life. Ship strikes are one. In heavily trafficked waters, a whale at the surface can be killed or badly injured by collision with large vessels. Entanglement in fishing gear is another. Ropes, nets, and traps do not care whether an animal is ancient, social, lactating, or migratory. A whale can drag gear for long distances, suffer infection, exhaust itself, lose feeding ability, or drown. Noise pollution is subtler but significant. In an acoustic world, chronic noise from shipping, sonar, and other human sources can interfere with communication, navigation, or behaviour. Habitat change and climate change add further layers. Climate change is not a single threat applied evenly. It alters sea ice, prey distributions, ocean temperatures, and timing patterns. For Arctic-associated whales such as bowheads and belugas, changing ice regimes can reshape the geography of feeding and movement. For baleen whales dependent on cold, productive systems, changes in prey abundance or phenology can ripple upward. A whale can swim across a vast range, but it cannot swim outside biology. If the prey field shifts, if migration timing comes out of sync with productivity, if breeding and feeding grounds change at different rates, the consequences accumulate. And yet, even here, whales resist becoming only symbols of loss. They are still present tense animals. Bowheads still move along ice edges. Humpbacks still sing on breeding grounds, and rush through bubble nets in northern waters. Blue whales still pursue dense krill resources, with bodies larger than anything else we know the Earth has made. Sperm whales still descend into darkness. Right whales still travel old routes along crowded coasts. The story is not over, and that matters. One of the things I find most restful about whale science is that it constantly returns the mind to scale without demanding panic. A whale is large, yes, but it is also part of a system of scales. The cell, the lung, the blood vessel, the muscle, the calf and the mother, the pod and the population, the migration corridor and the basin, the ocean current and the climate regime, the fossil timescale and the lifetime of one living female. Everything nests. Take the blue whale again. It is easy to let the largest animal fact dominate everything, but inside the blue whale are all the same old mammalian truths, just differently proportioned. Warm blood, nursing, lungs, a heart pushing oxygen where it must go, a calf learning to stay near, a route that must be timed to prey. The giant is still a mammal. It still breathes one breath at a time. Take the sperm whale. Its mythology often centers on the head, the deep dive, the squid, the old whaling narratives. But from a scientific view, its life is also full of ordinary continuities. Family groups, long maternal care, oxygen storage, sound production, careful use of a body under pressure. The strange is built from the familiar. Take the bowhead, Arctic, immense, enclosed in blubber, navigating ice, able to remain in cold seas that would challenge most mammals. And still there is a calf beside a mother, still there is a migration between conditions, still there is the need to surface and breathe. Take the humpback, breaching, singing, feeding in groups, travelling between worlds. So spectacular on the surface that we can forget how much of its life is actually about repetition. Swim, breathe, listen, feed, nurse, travel, sing, descend, rise. And take the right whale, perhaps the most sobering of our anchors. A species can be biologically magnificent and still terribly vulnerable to the geometry of human commerce. Surface behaviour, coastal migration, slow swimming, and historical accessibility combine to make right whales catastrophically exposed to us. Their continued survival now depends not on whether evolution equipped them cleverly enough, but on whether we can make room for them inside the systems we built. There is another reason whales invite calm attention. They are one of the clearest reminders that evolution is not a ladder, but a branching conversation with the environment. Whales did not become more advanced in some abstract final sense when they returned to water. They became more specialized for certain conditions. They traded one set of freedoms for another. Legs became unnecessary for running and useful only in transformed remnants. Hair gave way to blubber and hydrodynamics. Vision remained, but acoustics grew in importance. The body turned from a gravity-resisting structure to a buoyancy-working structure. Each change carried costs and opportunities. On land, mammals must support their own weight continuously. In water, buoyancy changes that equation. It permits large size in ways land often does not. But water also takes heat rapidly, resists motion, and withholds oxygen. So the whale body becomes an answer sheet to marine questions. Thick blubber for insulation, streamlining for reduced drag, powerful axial musculature for propulsion, modified limbs for steering, blowholes for efficient breathing, altered circulation for diving, hearing and sound production systems tuned to aquatic use, social behaviours adapted to vast mobile habitats. The result is not one whale design, but many. Some are streamlined, sprinting rorquals. Some are blockier, slow-moving skim feeders. Some are dark torpedoes of the deep. Some are Arctic specialists. Some are generalists. Some spend more time in social groups. Some range more loosely. Some are singers. Some are clickers. Some are both quiet and elusive in ways we barely understand. The rorquals, for instance, carry their own family resemblance. Pleated throats, relatively streamlined forms, and a feeding style built for engulfment and mobility. Blue whales, fin whales, sei whales, and minkies all belong in this broad architectural tradition, yet each makes a slightly different living. The fin whale often reads as speed and length, a long grey blade passing through offshore water. The sei whale is sleeker still in its reputation, a fast pelagic feeder that rarely lingers for human admiration. Minke whales seem almost modest by comparison, until one remembers that even the smaller baleen whales remain very large mammals by ordinary standards. Right whales and bowheads speak a different morphological dialect. Their bodies look less like speed and more like endurance. Their long baleen and arched jaws suit a filtering mode built around dense patches of planktonic prey. The bowhead's enormous head, thick blubber, and Arctic orientation make it seem in some ways like a relic from an older ocean, though of course it is no relic at all, only a living specialist of the north. Right whales, by contrast, carry the burden of proximity to human coasts, their biology made vulnerable by the very traits that once made them easy targets. Sperm whales are so distinctive that they seem to announce a separate design philosophy. The head dominates the silhouette. The blowhole sits asymmetrically. The dive profile points downward, not merely in posture, but in lifestyle. Where many baleen whales belong to the imagination of the surface and the horizon, sperm whales belong to the imagination of descent. They are hunters of vertical space. Then there are the beaked whales, among the most mysterious of the toothed forms. Many species are rarely seen well at sea, surfacing only briefly, diving deeply, and leaving behind far fewer observations than the more conspicuous whales. They remind us that whale science is not complete in the everyday sense. There are still lineages whose routines remain partly hidden from us, not because the animals are supernatural, but because the ocean is large and our access is limited. And standing a little at the edge of common language, though not at the edge of scientific importance, are the large dolphins such as killer whales and pilot whales, whose lives force us to think carefully about where casual names begin and end. A killer whale is, taxonomically speaking, an oceanic dolphin, but its role in discussions of cetacean social structure, culture, and predation is so central that no calm tour through whale science feels complete without acknowledging it. The labels matter less than the patterns they help us notice. This diversity is one reason the ocean never contains only one kind of whale season. In one region, at one time of year, the water may hold migrating humpbacks with calves. Elsewhere, blue whales may be tracking krill concentrations. Far north, bowheads navigate ice edges. In offshore depths, sperm whales and beaked whales work the vertical world below. The word whales gathers them into one folder on my desk tonight, but the sea distributes them widely according to prey, temperature, depth, and history. And still, despite that diversity, there are moments when they all seem to rhyme. The surface breath, the calf beside the mother, the long travel between resource-rich places, the dependence on sound, the mammalian inheritance under marine form, the need to return again and again to air. Those repetitions are what let us hold such different species together without flattening them into sameness. This diversity matters because it keeps us from flattening whales into a single personality. Human affection often does that. We say whales as if we mean one temperament, one intelligence, one life. But a blue whale is not a sperm whale, and a sperm whale is not a bowhead, and a bowhead is not a humpback, and none of them is identical in kind to a killer whale, however many family resemblances exist. Whale science becomes richer when we let the variation remain. Still, there are shared motifs, and one of the loveliest is breath. A whale lives by surfacing. However deep it dives, however remote it travels, however complex its social life, there comes a moment when the animal must return to air. It breaks the surface, the blowhole opens, the exhalation bursts outward, the inhalation follows, and the body either lingers or goes down again. For an air-breathing mammal in a marine world, breath is not background, it is rhythm. Perhaps that is why whales so often feel meditative, even when one knows the science. Their lives are organised around recurrence, dive and rise, feed and travel, season and migration, mother and calf, song and revision, death and whale fall. Repetition is not triviality, it is structure, and structure is what makes the whole system legible. I think too of the old mistake people made for centuries, seeing whales in water and classifying them with fishes simply because the environment seemed to define the animal. It was a very human error, sensible on the surface and wrong at depth. The deeper truth came from anatomy, from development, from fossils, from patient comparison. In that sense, whale science is also a lesson in how to look, not to stop at the obvious shape, but to ask what systems lie underneath, not to confuse where something lives with what it is. A whale lives in water, but it brings land ancestry with it. It is at home in the sea, but it has not ceased being mammalian to get there. It is ancient in lineage, but alive only in the present tense. It is immense, but built from tissues and behaviours that only make sense when considered piece by piece. And when you do consider them piece by piece, the great bulk of the animal somehow becomes more intimate, not less. The folder on my desk has grown warm under the lamp. Outside, the city is quieter now. The pane of the window has become a mirror, and for a moment the room seems to float inside its own darkness. I can almost imagine the office as a small, pressure-resistant chamber travelling through a much larger sea. The radiator murmurs, the page beneath my hand is still, and in the stillness, the whales feel both very far away and very near, moving under polar light, under fog, under moonlit swells, under shipping lanes, under storm tracks, under histories older than ours. If there is a final scientific comfort in all of this, it may be that whales are not miracles in the sense of breaking nature's rules. They are miracles in the older sense of inspiring attention. Everything they do belongs to biology. Evolution explains them, anatomy explains them, physiology explains them, ecology explains them, and yet explanation does not reduce them, it deepens them. The more clearly we see how a whale became possible, the more astonishing the whale becomes. From a warm Eocene shoreline to the open pelagic world, from feet pushing through shallows to flukes driving through blue water, from nostrils at the snout to blowholes at the crown, from semi-aquatic hunters to baleen giants and deep-diving toothed hunters, from mothers with calves in sheltered water to migrations crossing hemispheres, from songs passed among humpbacks to codas shared among sperm whales, from nutrient plumes at the surface to whale falls in the dark. The story holds together. It is one long transformation, still ongoing in the sense that living whales continue to meet a changing world with bodies and behaviours inherited from a very long past. And that is where I think we can close the case file for tonight. Not with spectacle, though there is plenty of that, and not with sorrow, though some of that belongs here too, but with a quieter recognition. A whale is a mammal that went back to the sea and learned, over immense time, how to belong there completely without ever ceasing to be what it was in origin. Warm-blooded, air-breathing, milk-giving, socially alive. The ocean did not erase its ancestry, it transformed it. Somewhere tonight, a whale is surfacing into cold air, drawing one deliberate breath and slipping under again. The sea closes over the place it was, but not over the story. The story remains, moving slowly on,